I call Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise in support of the Gambling Amendment number 3 bill in its second reading. And may I start, Mr Speaker, just by saying that it was an absolute privilege to serve on the Government Administration Committee and to hear submissions on this amendment. I'd like to take the opportunity right now to acknowledge all of the submitters, and particularly those who work in the areas of problem gambling and with people affected by issues around gambling. And particularly, sir, we heard from a number of individuals who themselves have experienced all of the trauma and upset and stress and financial misery that does unfortunately afflict some in our community with problems around gambling. They were extraordinarily courageous, sir, to share their very private and traumatic stories with the committee. I thank them for showing that courage and would like to take this opportunity to reiterate, as I think other members have done, that the committee listened very closely to what they had to say and took that into consideration as we worked through the evidence on the bill. Sir, as I think has been covered, but it is important, we should look at the purpose of Class 4 gambling, or the nature of what it adds to New Zealand. So, sir, New Zealanders spend around $700 million a year on pokie machines in the year 13 to 14, and about $246 million of funds are distributed through non-club societies to community groups, sporting groups and other very, very worthy recipients across our society. This is an entertainment and an activity that helps to fund many groups in need, sir. And I think it's important within that to look at the statistics of problem gambling, because I think that is where the submissions in either in opposition or in concern to these changes were raised. So, for instance, in the data from 2012 supplied by the Department of Internal Affairs, 0.7% of New Zealanders are listed as having problem gambling issues, with a further 1.8% at a moderate risk. So what that's saying to us, Mr Speaker, is that for that number of people, there is a very real and deeply affecting issue, one that this Parliament ought to give real consideration to. But as most things in a legislative process, sir, there is a balance. And the balance that we also need to bear in mind here is that for 99.3% of people, gambling and this form of gambling does not represent a clinical or defined problem level of gambling and its associated problems. So we do need to bear that in mind, sir, and the committee did as we worked through the evidence we heard and as we reached the amendments that we recommended and which are reflected, sir, in the bill as it was recommended back to the House for this reading. I'd also note, just in finishing on that area, is that we saw the greatest reductions in problem gambling in the 1990s, and the data shows us that that level has remained fairly stable since then. So great work has been done, and as I say, sir, the vast majority of people gamble responsibly and without issues arising from that. Now, the main purposes from this amendment are to increase transparency of grant making, which is very important, to reduce potential conflicts of interest, which are of great concern around our communities, to simplify compliance and reduce cost. And particularly there was an issue around the appeals process. And I may deal with more than one or two of those, sir, but what I really want to spend some time on right now is this area of potential commission payment for venue operators. Because, and I will acknowledge, sir, that certainly most submitters that themselves aren't either corporate societies or venue operators, most submitters were submitting in opposition to a move to commission payment. But while they all expressed concerns about what might happen, it is very important that we note that not one submitter, and I will particularly reference Professor Bill Abbott, the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean at the Auckland University of Technology, who himself was very open that there is no evidence to suggest that a commission payment would result in high levels of problem gambling or incentivise inappropriate behaviours. And I will acknowledge, sir, that Professor Abbott was opposed and principally didn't want to see a commission-based approach, but he did acknowledge that there is no evidence in New Zealand or around the world that actually demonstrates that a move to such a system will in fact incentivise improper behaviours or lead to worse outcomes. And I'd like to have a wee look at what even leads the department or this parliament to consider the possibility that we might allow through regulatory powers a commission-based system. Quite frankly, sir, the venue cost at the moment is a highly complicated set of formulae which are difficult and costly for venues to manage, difficult and costly for the department as the regulator and overseer to actually also oversee and manage from a compliance perspective, and which in reality, if you are a reasonable or large-size venue, actually has led to a situation where these venue operators are getting what amounts to a capped commission of 16% of takings per machine. So we actually have by de facto, or you could argue by design, but by de facto nature of the complicated means that we have, there are 4 different limits that are used in determining what the venue machine costs are today. 3 of them are mutually exclusive, but the 4th one can operate with any of the other 3. What they've found is that the option D, the final one, has actually become that de facto standard, 16%, when you get to a sizable operation. So, sir, we are further challenged in determining that by the regulations around the cost inputs. So the Department of the legislation as it stands demands that the costs are reasonable, actual and necessary. But how the costs are determined are subject to the decisions of the department as the regulator. So they determine what tasks can be included in the actual real and necessary cost inputs, and the amount of time each of those tasks will take, and the reasonable value therefore of each of those tasks. And in fact, a couple of submitters highlighted to us that those tasks, the durations, and more importantly, the employee pay scale for delivering those hasn't been looked at for years and hasn't even been adjusted to meet inflation. And while inflation might be at 0.1% now, sir, it has been running in previous years, particularly prior to this government, at much higher rates than that. So what we have a potential situation that the costs that are being allowed to be claimed at the moment may not actually be truly reflective of the costs to run those machines in the venues. And look, those submitters also pointed out, Mr. Speaker, that they just take into account a portion, a tiny, tiny portion of an employee that the business still has to fund for the rest of their time of employment. So it actually can create a real challenge for those. So the options that were in front of the committee were to retain the status quo, which would be bad, it's complicated and unwieldy, to go to a set charge per machine, which we also discovered through discussions in committee would mean that some venues would come out winners and some venues would come out losers, and we don't, I think, overall want to see that either. But in the commission, there's more than one way to skin the proverbial cat, sir. We could have just an open commission that says that the more that you collect, the more you will get ad infinitum. We could have a tiered commission based on whether you're a small number of machines at your venue, a medium or a large number, or we could in fact just have a cap that said that you charge a commission but it goes to a certain level, could be that 16% even, and then stops. And so as a committee we did determine that perhaps the best way to address this was actually to go through a consultative process through the regulator, and therefore that's really what drove the decision, the recommendation, to do it through a regulation, rather than through the principal legislation, sir. And that's why we have come back proposing that. And just as I close off on this issue of commission payment, I'd just like to make this point because I think it's very important, that if it is the venue operator that is getting commission based on the takings, it's the behaviour of the operator that's at question, not the behaviour of the gambler. It won't affect the gambler at all. And just simply with something like Lotto, sir, we see evidence that it doesn't necessarily, in fact, it doesn't see a rise in bad behaviour by the operators. So, sir, I think this bill has been returned. It's very sound and pragmatic, and I commend it to the House.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the amendments recommended by the Government Administration Committee by a majority be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. A party vote's called for. I'll ask the clerk to conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
2 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 opposed.
New Zealand First.
12 opposed.
Maori Party.
2 opposed.
Ag New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Members, the ayes are 93, the noes are 28. The amendments are agreed to. The question now is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. A party vote's called for. Ask the clerk to conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 opposed.
New Zealand First.
12 opposed.
Maori Party.
2 opposed.
Ag New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Members, the ayes are 93, the noes are 28. The motion is agreed to.
Gambling Amendment Bill number 3, second reading.
This bill is set down for committee stage next sitting day. I call on Government Order of the Day number 4.